Hello and welcome to episode 7 of the OPFS podcast. My name is Philippa Kemp and I'm the comms officer at OPFS, and I'm hosting the podcast today with two different guests. I'm recording this episode during Pride Month 2023, and today I'm joined by my colleague Caitlin Logan, who's the policy research and influencing lead, and Jules Stapelton from LGBT Health and Wellbeing.
Hello.
Let me begin by introducing our first guest, Caitlin Logan. Caitlin works at One Parent Families Scotland as our policy research and influencing lead, and it is her job to make sure that the experiences and views of single parent families are heard by decision makers. Caitlin has worked and volunteered for equalities organisations, and she's written as a journalist about equalities issues for news publications. She is particularly interested in LGBT rights and gender equality. Thank you for joining us today, Caitlin.
Hi.
And to our second guest, Jules. So Jules has been working for LGBTQ plus community development since 2010 in LGBT health and wellbeing, based in Edinburgh, is that right?
Based in Edinburgh, yeah, down in Leith now.
So she's an experienced podcast person, or at least radio broadcaster, and apparently ex-pub quiz host, current pub quiz host.
Yeah. I did more pub quizzes than I hosted radio shows. So.
And your job now is to coordinate LGBT health and wellbeing queer events programme.
That's
and
right.
Is that just in Edinburgh, or is that also?
That's just in Edinburgh, but I have a counterpart in Glasgow who does the same role.
Could you tell me a little bit about the Rainbow Families group that you run?
I would love to.
Yeah.
I would love to. So Rainbow Family started as a community-led group years and years ago. When I first started in 2010, there were already some parents meeting, a small group of people meeting on a regular basis at our previous premises not far from here in the new town. And through the years that has expanded. In some regards it's expanded in terms of the community. There are more people wanting to access safer spaces for families to get together, for queer families to get together. But funding has always kind of put a bit of a constraint on that. So through my programme, we used to have a small funded Rainbow Families project, which was a kind of 3-year project that funding wasn't renewed for. And so now what I do is I host quarterly events through the events programme. So my events programme is for anyone 16 plus, and that's right across the kind of LGBTQ plus community in Edinburgh, anyone travelling to Edinburgh, anyone living around Edinburgh. And so I host one event per quarter for LGBTQ plus families.
Okay.
And because there's just one a quarter, those events are growing and growing in numbers. And there is a real demand on that being something that happens more often, which is where I sort of struggle and come up with some challenge in regards to resourcing.
Okay.
Because I would love to be hosting a monthly. We definitely have a vibrant community of bi and lesbian mums, for example, who come along, where there are lots of women with families, and we are having a growing number of dads kind of accessing the space, but we also have families who are coming along with their young people in their family who are identifying as LGBTQ+. And so as a family, they're looking for a safe space. And, I've known parents over the years to perhaps have begun using the term mum for themselves, but no longer do, and use a different term for themselves, and maybe they've been on a journey with their gender in terms of kind of exploring who they are and how they'd like to be referred to. So language changes, people's labels change. The most important thing for us is that it's giving people an opportunity to connect with each other and a sense of identity in the community, a sense of a kind of belonging to something bigger.
Okay.
And it is pretty big. The community is pretty big.
When did you tell me when it was founded? How long has the Rainbow Families group been going?
So the regular group, I think, started predates me in 2010. I think perhaps my an ex-colleague, Lauren Fox, I think, was around when that was started. I feel it may have crossed over with the Lesbian Mothers group. There may have been a link there. Mm-hmm. It kind of predates me, so I wouldn't want to speak to that. But I certainly came into the role knowing that it was important to have a regular space.
Sure.
For then LGBTQ plus parents, but we've
And you mentioned the Lesbian Mothers Group there. I'm just going to go over to Caitlin, because the Lesbian Mothers Group was founded by a director of OPFS, One Parent Family Scotland. Can you tell me a little bit about the history?
Yeah, well, so this is something that I just learned about very recently, a few months ago. Yeah, came up in a kind of discussion with a colleague and learned that the previous chief executive of OPFS, or director, had sort of became Lesbian Mothers Scotland, and I think there was a couple of like groups in different places. And so I actually ended up speaking to her. Sort of for something that I was writing, and that was really interesting to learn a bit about that history, as she had said that so that's Sue Robertson, and she had sort of someone had kind of came to her and suggested or asked if they could use like a space in One Parent Family Scotland's headquarters in Edinburgh at that time for this group, you know, even before Section 28 was repealed. And obviously, yeah, quite a very different time from now, but a time when a lot of change was happening. So I think that I'd kind of learned about this because one of our other colleagues had sort of been part of that group. This is Stacey Pouch Scott, who's part of our organisation, who actually was one of the people who then did go from being part of that group to being involved in the Rainbow Families at that time, in the sort of early noughties. And I think, yeah, it's sort of an interesting thing that had sort of been highlighted when I was having those kind of conversations, is that how things sort of quite quickly changed in a way from it being maybe the majority of people were in that situation where they'd had a child from a previous marriage to be in a situation where more and more same-sex couples were having children together. And so it's interesting to kind of reflect on how that makeup has kind of changed over time, though there will still be people in both of those situations. I think, and yeah, sort of something that I'd kind of thought about is that One Parent Family Scotland, like I had no knowledge, and I think a lot of us probably didn't know that there was that sort of connection, that those groups had been kind of run, and that was their sort of address, was connected, but in a way it was a little bit of like an offshoot. And I think that part of why I suppose it's important to talk about that history is to make that more visible and remember that, you know, these things were happening, and that this is sort of all this work that has been put in by people to get us to the point where we are today, but that today organisations like ours still have a lot of work to do to be more inclusive and representative.
Jules, you will have seen a bit of change even over that short period of time that you're saying. Well, not really short, because it's been since 2010 that you've been involved. And yeah, I was talking about the different makeup of families, parents that maybe been married to a man, have had a child together, and then perhaps gone on to be a single parent.
Yeah, as society has become, or is leaning towards more providing more support for people to come out, I think it did enable people to look at a different future for themselves and kind of explore what that might look like. But I think what I'm imagining around that time when the Lesbian Mothers Group was founded is that there would have been very little support out there, very little kind of any legal guidance or inclusive legal guidance for parents going through any kind of change in their previous relationship and what that might look like. But also people were using people's sexuality against them in court when it came to custody battles. And so there was, you know, a huge amount of stress and worry and fear, I think, for a lot of parents not that long ago. Support for making a family, and that being legally quite straightforward, means that it's possible. You know, it's become possible for queer families to go ahead and, you know, create families themselves without the kind of hurdles that people were facing before. So I've seen a big kind of increase in particularly women coming forward in relationships with other women starting families together and going through fertility treatment and going through both NHS and private services, and then looking to have support along that journey. So we do have a lot of people accessing member families who've been through it, who are now embarking upon it and wanting to connect with the community before they do it. So that's very vibrant, I would say. But I've also seen a real change over the recent years, even more recent than when I started working at LGBT Health, in that more men are having families together. It's becoming more possible and more socially accepted, although there's still a long way to go, for men to start families together and be supported to do that, either as single parents, like in the case of a guy that I spoke to who'd been through St Andrew's Adoption Agency, went through the whole process of adopting as a single gay dad, and it was possible, and he was supported, and it went well, and that's kind of paved the way for more men to be starting families, either as single parents or as in partnerships. And so I'm seeing more dads, and more men turn up to events, which is brilliant. But there's also a lot of people who are being more supported to kind of come out as their real selves in terms of their gender identity, and that means that we are seeing it's not a kind of binary limit around the labels for parents. People are coming into rainbow families and just exploring what kind of parent labels they want to use, and so are the kids. So yeah, we have a lot of trans and non-binary parents, people who have either been out for a long time or who are just coming out. Mm-hmm. And a lot of support is needed in that regard, because we are very far from it being a safe environment outside of queer spaces for trans and non-binary people.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's an altogether different landscape that we're operating on at the moment than, say, perhaps what Caitlin was describing before, the sort of landscape that was around when the Lesbian Mothers group was founded, which is a really positive. It's a really positive. I think diversity has always been there. I think people, trans and non-binary people have always been there. But at that point, at the turn of the century in early 2000s, it would have been unheard of for people to be coming out in the way that they are beginning to now. It's a worrying time. Yeah, a current sort of climate of hostility, I suppose. That must be one of the main challenges that you're facing, being an LGBT inclusive organisation.
Yeah, I mean, the hostility and hate that is kind of perpetuated through, media, but also politics. I mean, so many different places and spaces that people have to live in around. That hostility is is targeted at trans and non-binary people, but it doesn't further progress or further the well-being of anyone in the LGBTQ+ community. It speaks to patriarchal, misogynist society and systems that doesn't serve anybody. So it's a pretty worrying time for equalities.
Yeah, and how do you respond to that hostility?
We don't. I think that's the most important thing, is to focus our attention on the community and the people who need safer spaces. And you touched earlier on the idea of why we need LGBTQ+ spaces and safer spaces, because we need spaces that are validating, that provide reassurance, that provide a sense of security and connection that people are just not able to find necessarily outside of those spaces.
Yeah, and that's what you're offering, as opposed to like a more generic service.
Yeah, and the thing is, I think, so a really good example of how we can move forward is for us to be creating queer spaces where we're creating spaces directed towards LGBTQ+ people, but we're bringing other organisations along the way. So Dad's Rock, for example, we'll be doing some ongoing work with them, and Thomas over at Dad's Rock has been attending our events and planning with us in the background to look at how we can best support dads, not just in a kind of queer setting, but in those other organisational settings that are providing really bespoke support for people. And what Dad's Rock is doing is very bespoke, and it's very, and it's built around experience and engagement that we haven't had. But we do have the engagement with the queer community and LGBTQ+ people, and in particular gay, bi and trans and non-binary dads. And so it's bringing us two together. It's just a really fruitful experience. And I think we're sort of I think I can speak for Thomas when I say this, that it's an ongoing thing. You know, I think organisations, it's not about doing one-offs together. I think it is about embedding each other's knowledge of each other's organisations in our work, so that we're signposting and that we are letting people know that there are other safe spaces they can go to outside of an LGBTQ+ space.
Caitlin, would you like to add anything from a personal or professional perspective about the importance of safe spaces for queer families or single parents?
Yeah, I mean, sure, yeah, there's a few things that I could say, but I mean, I think I had been sort of thinking about this in terms of just recently that I was speaking to the person that's going to be the celebrant for my wedding next month, and she was actually one of the two women that were the first two women to be legally married.
That's
in,
great.
Yeah, in Scotland, and so it's.
Were they the ones splashed all over the newspapers at that time?
Yes, yeah.
Did Nicola Sturgeon go to their wedding?
Uh-huh.
I think there was
Yeah. No, unfortunately, I don't think Nicola Sturgeon's coming to my wedding, but well, if she hears this and she wants to come, then she can.
There's an invitation for you, Nicola.
There you go. Yes.
But yeah, so it was basically that. So she was kind of saying how obviously from their experience as being a kind of older couple, and that they, like many others, had sort of had basically like three weddings, from having like one that was a kind of secret one that wasn't officially recognised, to having a civil partnership, to then having a legal marriage. It just confirmed that it was a good decision, that we sort of had wanted to specifically try and get a gay celebrant, as that kind of connection to that history and also to that present day experience, but actually that understanding of the experience of being a minority and being, you know, in a society, like as you've said, where obviously there are still negative attitudes, but I think, yeah, being in that, I suppose, yeah, having someone there that you know can like understand and also fully celebrate that, like celebrate the, you know what I mean.
I do.
So I think that in a way it's sort of something that I thought about, that I think that a lot of people maybe that haven't had that experience, you know, a lot of maybe like straight cis people, maybe it's hard to understand how, like, why would you need that, or you know, in the sense that obviously like now, well, as you've said, for especially for trans people, it's often not the case that you could just kind of go anywhere, but maybe people think more so for gay people, well, yeah, you could. There's a lot less homophobia than there was in the past in many ways, and you know, you have you could go to any sort of group in theory, and obviously for some people, I'm sure that, you know, people do have those the same experience as anyone else, in terms of like having positive experiences in other wider groups and things, but it's still so important that people can have spaces where they know that it's fully understood, and it's like, yeah, that kind of shared experience.
Yeah, totally.
I feel, yeah, I guess thinking of the wider context and things about the sort of work that we're doing as an organisation, it's sort of like, whether it's LGBT parents or any other sort of parents that are impacted by different kind of equalities, I think it's that sort of thinking about the next step between being like, obviously we would all like to think, well, we're not like discriminating against anyone, but it's, I think, going beyond that to sort of try and be proactively like inclusive and visible and representative.
Yeah, totally. You asked earlier on, Philippa, about how organisations like One Parent Family Scotland can create safer spaces in what you're doing. And we have, as an organisation, we're having this conversation with quite a few different places, and it's really the same message that goes out to everyone, which is to really look at what a person's experience is from the moment they contact you or need to contact you, and where they feel validated, where they will feel affirmed in terms of who they are. And so from the moment that a person wants to find out about you, usually on the internet, I'm imagining, through a website, possibly a phone number. From that moment, everything that happens is going to either create a space that affirms who they are and validates their situation or not. And I think there's so much that happens on a systemic level with good intentions. There's so much that happens that doesn't validate LGBTQ plus people, but not because people aren't willing, but because we just have a way of being and working that isn't geared up for directing a service at LGBTQ plus people. The moment somebody picks up the phone and assumes somebody's a woman on the phone and says, I've got a lady on the phone here looking for this, when they have no idea if that person identifies as a woman or not. Using really gendered language in your kind of welcoming, whether that's through the website, whether that's on a phone, whether that's at the front door, whether you have inclusive toilets, whether a person who's non-binary has to put themselves in a box by coming here, like all of that sort of stuff. It just builds up. One thing that's not perfect might be okay, and people can kind of, queer people are very used to putting up with things not feeling like it's made for them. But it's when everything happens all at once. So when you walk into a service and people make assumptions about your gender or assumptions about your situation, and then you can't find the right toilets, and then somebody misgenders you again on the way out, the whole thing just builds up to create a space that just doesn't see you and doesn't validate you. But actually, on a more serious level, it harms you if it's happening again and again and again. So I'm thinking about the parents that come and access rainbow families. There's a number of parents who are solo parenting or single parenting. The single parents I can think of who come and access rainbow families, I think of their journeys and I sort of worry about them as individuals having to navigate services outside of a kind of queer setting, because I think I predict that they won't get it right because they're non-binary, for example, or they're a trans person, and it's not, organisations are just not yet set up for it. And they might be in policy, they might have thought about things more broadly, but when you walk into a building and you're kind of meeting staff, as soon as that gendered language comes into play, that it's not embedded, that inclusive language isn't embedded, and that equalities you might feel the intention of it, but it's just how it feels in practice. And I think we had I had a great meeting recently at the Maternity Voices Partnership with the NHS, and the head of midwifery was there with a lot of midwives, and there was such a good energy for doing the right thing. Like myself and colleagues from the Equality Network were there talking about inclusive language in perinatal care for parents, and there is such a goodwill, which is a really positive thing. I think that's progress. When you can be in a room full of 30 people who are actively out there doing, practitioners who are working on the ground. The thing that's making it difficult is the systems. The thing that's making it difficult is that there isn't this overarching law and legislation that supports the idea of getting it right. And so that, because of that, something like the NHS, which has a very binary setup in terms of how it uses language in its medical notes, and how any person goes through that service, they are put in a box from the moment they arrive. They're sort of inhibited at the moment. But there is great will and there's really great intention, and that's such a good place to start.
Yes, and I suppose it can't be down to individuals within an organisation, because then you don't have consistency across the board if it's just by chance that you happen upon a midwife who gets it.
Yeah. And as somebody said in that meeting, quite a senior person in the room said, I know this isn't going to happen quickly. So I think that's important to just manage expectations. What the queer community really needs from an NHS, particularly thinking about trans and non-binary people, is they need a service that is built for them, that fits from the moment that you kind of enter that service. It's not going to happen quickly with the NHS. But there is stuff they can do on the ground, and this is a message to all organisations, I think. There's stuff they can do when it comes to people and personable and interpersonal skills that can change quite quickly. And that's to do with language, it's to do with assumptions. And it sounds like you're doing
Yeah, well, I mean,
you're doing your best with that. That you know, the fact that you're hosting this podcast just says a lot.
No,
I think,
I suppose that's true. I mean, there's a long way to go still as well. We have our Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion group at OPFS, which is specifically looking at how to be more inclusive and diverse. And Caitlin, I'm not sure if you want to say anything more about that.
So yeah, also that kind of spells out Jedi, as I should point out. So,
Jedi,
yeah,
amazing.
Jedi group.
Awesome.
I know. I'm not actually really sure who came up with it, but it's yeah, I guess it just emphasises that we're like leading the way on positive change, or, you know.
That's good. And how does it feel for you both? Do you feel that change on the ground? Do you feel those changes being implemented?
Well, I feel like it's at a very early stage in a way. So the sort of the group, I guess it was about a year ago that sort of started meeting, and there are certain things that we've been working on, like even just reviewing our equalities policies and procedures and things like that, and then started working around kind of recommendations for a like equalities action plan and those sorts of things that I suppose are quite internal and maybe sound quite boring, but obviously
no, they're absolutely integral. They're really important.
So all those kind of things are being worked on, and things like around as well changing how we record information about the people that come to us for support. So just trying to be better at basically recording more equalities information so that we can know on an overall picture who the people are that we actually are supporting and what the gaps are, but also to I suppose to help have more of that information on the specific people that we're supporting, so that those are things that we obviously want the people supporting parents to be thinking about as well, and that there are maybe some of those, I guess some equalities areas are obviously ones that will have been less represented than others and less thought about than others, and I would say probably in terms of like the LGBT side of thing, that's probably one that has been maybe less represented or less considered than some other aspects of equalities. And just I think obviously through not intentionally, but it's almost like maybe not the first thing that people are thinking about in a way, but that's something that we're kind of trying to talk about more, and just across the board on equalities issues. But even with things like that, like as you say, we're doing this podcast and we're going to Pride on Saturday and trying to make ourselves a bit more visible, so that people know that obviously we're here, and
it's a really nice step.
But I think like you said about the thing with the NHS as well, I mean, I guess that it's with anything that it's not like a process that happens overnight, and that it's something that to be done meaningfully is will kind of take a lot of work and process. And I think that something else that we're working on is that there's new sort of positions in the organisation around training, and I think that they're looking to kind of roll out more training around different aspects of inequality and different experiences of single parents in that way, so that hopefully can make a difference if we can get some I mean, I think it would benefit everyone in a way to have that specialist training, because it's sort of that thing where even with the best of intentions, there's obviously going to be organisations like yours that have that expertise and that can that can help. So
I think one thing I would say about organisations who are at this really kind of enthusiastic point of going forward with LGBTQ plus equality stuff particularly, although this probably relates to many other strands of equalities work, is that consultation and over consultation has and continues to exhaust the community, and it's just kind of not needed because the evidence and the research is out there. So if you're thinking it would be really good to know, for example, what a trans or a non-binary or trans and non-binary parent might need when they come to One Parent Family Scotland, that information of what that person might need is already out there. The Equality Network have done some really great research around families, around people making families and fertility and all sorts of stuff. There's really useful stats and information in there to find, so I'd really recommend you contact them to get hold of that. Becky Crowther has been leading on that and also provides training. So there is lots of resource out there actually, because what can happen is people contact us. And I say can happen, it does happen on a fairly regular basis. We'd really like to speak to some trans people about what their views are on how they would access this service. Don't do that. Don't do that. The community is exhausted and under attack, and really needs, more than anything, needs kind of affirming and validating experiences of life to be able to just function at the moment, rather than kind of being used as sort of ways to help organisations progress. So I think the evidence is out there. Organisations like ourselves and Equality Network and LGBT Youth Scotland have tons of information, but they also have like loads of anecdotal experiences with the community that can be shared, that will be of use. And that's probably the best way forward, is to go to those organisations for that information. Positive outcome to this that is going to come back and improve the well-being of not only the people in the room that contributed, but also the rest of the community. Often we don't see that part of it. We just people are going through the motions.
I mean, yeah, I think that we kind of know of that sort of experience with single parents as well.
I'm sure it must be the same. Yeah,
especially, I mean, because obviously there's quite a high rate of single parents that are in poverty, and so looking around, plans from anyone really, but governments and things around addressing some of those kind of issues. Single parents are very often consulted, as they are kind of impacted by multiple different inequalities and barriers and things, but I think that something that parents will often say is that they do feel that they sort of share the same thing repeatedly, and then
there's only so many times you can tell your story, right?
and sometimes it is like it just kind of goes into a report and maybe there's recommendations, but then it's like, are those recommendations actually acted on? So I think I definitely get that point, that it's like on so many things we do know, like we already know kind of what needs to happen, but it's just actually the will and the resource to implement it.
You just mentioned there about being impacted by multiple inequalities, and I think that's such an important consideration when thinking about doing any kind of equalities work, is the intersectional experiences that people have. We were just meeting with Shakti recently, and also a project called Aditi, which is within SACRO, and we were looking at how we can create kind of safer spaces for queer people of colour and Black and minority ethnic people, as they would describe them in their organisation. And it's really interesting that even now, I think it's, organisations get used to sort of looking at a strand of equalities work as a sort of homogenous group of and we do too. And I think it's such a good reminder that the experiences of a queer Black single parent who comes from a really tight-knit religious community is going to be really, really different from a white single parent who isn't within a kind of really tight-knit religious community. And their experiences, even though those two people may be queer, are not going to be the same, and that no two queer experiences are going to be the same, really. So it's really important for us as an organisation to be looking at how we address those barriers for folk coming into a queer space as well. And I'm thinking also for parents and rainbow families, I wonder how it would feel, for a queer person of colour as a single parent who does come from a religious background and a kind of tight-knit community, coming into a rainbow family space. How does that feel to be, first of all, in a predominantly white space, which it will be. So we have to sort of, I think that's just really important for us to bear that in mind as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about that as well, how it's like, it's so important to acknowledge and to understand the fact that people are like as you say, they're not one part of their identity. They're impacted by so many different experiences and parts of their identity, and that, as you say, people impacted by multiple inequalities, but also that there's so much, like for those of us working in this kind of area, supporting people impacted by any kinds of inequality, and also for people in general that are, doing activism around any different kind of inequality, it's important to actually work together and to understand the overlaps and the links between these different things, because you can't view any one thing in isolation, because often it is so interconnected, and it's, as you kind of mentioned about the sort of misogynistic patriarchy and all of this, and also I'd add a kind of very unequal capitalist society. It's that sort of serves to reinforce all of these inequalities, and if we're kind of looking at each one separately, in a way you're not seeing that whole picture and how it all connects. And I think, yeah, it's why sort of taking these steps to actually work more closely together is really important.
Yeah, definitely. It just helps me, for example, when I'm thinking about putting on events, just even meeting up today and being involved in this podcast will bring single parents closer to my mind. When I'm thinking about programming, and when I'm thinking about looking through the feedback and the kind of context of that feedback, what people are giving as well. I wonder if they're a single parent. I wonder if that's the reason why this might be a bit harder, or there might be a challenge here. So it's really, I think there's just something about being mindful of the experiences of others and the what is currently impacting other, the people who are going to be accessing your services. And one of the biggest steps towards being mindful of those things is knowing about them. And so if you have staff members who just don't know any trans people, or don't know any non-binary people, and don't know anything about what's happening for trans and non-binary people, it's really, really important that you find out, but you find out from resources that are affirming and validating of those people's lives. Yeah. So looking for training from Quality Network, for example, or resources that you can get from kind of inclusive and safe organisations for trans and
I was going to ask you, Jules, the importance of being somebody with lived experience. Obviously, you're a queer parent, and how important that is. Obviously, you're in an organisation that you feel very safe because of the nature of it. And how important it is to have lived experience within those kind of places.
It's interesting. I think it's such an interesting discussion, this thinking about who's delivering services and who for, and what their experience is and how they're involved. And I mean, it's the question around, how important is it for me to be delivering that kind of,
I suppose,
work as a queer person?
Yeah, potentially, but also I suppose about people who are service users coming to your service. Does it make it easier for them knowing and that you yourself are a queer parent?
I think so. I think, well, I know it would for me, but I think I'm always mindful that I'm only one queer parent. I'm white, I'm non-disabled, I have a sort of English sort of quite middle class accent, so there's just, I'm one type of queer parent, and I know I certainly won't represent, anyone else's experience other than my own. But there is something about the way queer professionals have an impact on their work by being out, and creating an affirming space for that. I think there's real value in it, for sure. I'm not saying everyone who works in a queer organisation needs to be queer, but if you were all not queer, that would be very evident. And I think, I think I work in a predominantly kind of queer-led environment, which is very helpful. I think, like for me as a queer parent, what I want to know, I just don't want to feel like an afterthought. And I navigated going through making a baby. It took 6 years because we were jumping through the hoops. Neither one of us in full-time jobs could afford to just endlessly do fertility treatment. We had to use, our privilege and resources that we had, from inheritance and things which not everybody has access to make a family. And I mean, we wouldn't have been able to do any of that. We would have been scuppered at the first hurdle if we didn't have any cash, because there was no service offered by the NHS. There was no opportunity for us to go through IVF with the NHS. It had to be private. If you don't have any sperm, you've got to buy it. It's thousands and thousands of pounds, unless you know someone. Plenty of people in the community are doing it DIY and really effectively and safely in a really brilliant kind of collaborative way with other queer community members. So that is definitely possible. But for us, we didn't have those connections at that point. So we had to pay for it. There was huge amounts of money that had to go towards that. And then when you're entering into that whole process, there wasn't a step along the way that we weren't reminded that we were not an afterthought. Do you know, every single moment we went to a meeting, there was a kind of, right, let me get the paperwork, I'll scrub that bit out, I'll scrub Dad's name out, it's just everything was just trying to, and I would say we had a good experience of it. I was incredibly validated as a woman with a womb. I would say that as a birth parent, a lot of the attention is on you. I don't think my wife had that same experience. I think as a second parent who was not a dad, I think that they don't really know what to do with you. They try and fit you into the dad's way of treating you and then see if it works. And interestingly, they do things like, when they select sperm on the basis of making it look like the dad. This is how their service is set up, because they want the dad to feel more secure in having a baby that looks a bit like them. But when we asked about our selection of sperm, and they give you very little information, but when we asked about it, they said, yeah, so we usually match up the sperm with and they almost said dad, with the other parent. And I said, okay, so how did that go? And my wife is very dark-haired. And they said, so, your donor's blonde. Like, they listed all this stuff. So they just had looked at her and thought, well, you won't want the same thing a dad would want. And that's true. But it's so funny how they're making all these decisions. It's a lot of assumptions, right, along the way. It's just a bit of a mess. So you constantly feel like they're trying to do the right thing. You're in their office. They're providing the service eventually. But it is, and that is, as a cis person, I cannot imagine how that journey would have been for Steph and I, as two cis people, had we not been cis.
Yeah.
And I don't really have to imagine, because people tell me how it is, and it's pretty horrendous. And a lot of people do it stealthily. They go, I know two single parents who are trans who did it stealthily and didn't tell the NHS who they really were, and had to go through a long period of time just sitting with the discomfort of the misgendering because it was easier in their mind. But actually what we learn now is, years later, it's not easier, it's traumatic. And trauma has an impact, and they're going to work, they're looking to try and work through that years and years later. So it's really unhealthy to not be able to present at the services yourself. We know that the mental health impact is huge. So, we were cis people going through that. I can't imagine what it would have been like. If we weren't. You're always just fitting around a very heteronormative situation. And I think that's the thing. It's like looking at your organisation. Are you heteronormative who are going to squeeze queer people in on the side, or are you going to look at how you as an organisation can really see the world differently? And I think that's a big question for our organisation too. It's not just for yourselves. It's a big challenge. Because the systems are pretty embedded, they're pretty strong.
Jules, for anyone that's listening that wants to find out more about rainbow families, how they can get involved, what would be the first step for them?
So, two ways. Hop on the website to find out my email address, or actually probably the most direct way is to get yourself signed up to our e-bulletin. And so we have a Rainbow Families e-bulletin that goes out quarterly, and in that newsletter you'll get all the information about all the events coming up. It also provides links to wider events programs. So if you, as an adult, as a parent, wanted to kind of access other support and other services, then the links are in that bulletin as well, including the helpline information, which can be really crucial. So that's a really useful way. I'm conscious that there are people who are not necessarily attached to tech or have access to digital spaces very often or as conveniently as other people do. And so for those people, you can pick up the phone, speak to somebody on the helpline, and they'll talk you through how to get involved. But you can also leave a message for me, and I can call you back. And that will be to call our organisation's main number, which I cannot remember, but is on the website.
On the website.
Yeah.
And you're based in Edinburgh, but you do have services in Glasgow.
We do.
As
yeah,
well.
we do. Yeah. We have services in Glasgow, and we have a whole breadth of stuff happening in Edinburgh. So if you're a trans non-binary person, 16 plus, we have a support programme around events and one-to-ones and workshops to kind of.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
and we'll be seeing you at Pride on Saturday, where we'll have a stall. So you're coming to Pride, then look out for One Parent Family Scotland and LGBT Health and Wellbeing.
Yeah, please come over and say hi. My colleague Michelle will be there with various other people that are going to be doing their turn on the stall. And I will get there eventually, but I'll have to march my way there.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jules, for taking part in the podcast today.
You're so welcome, and all the very best with your journey as an organisation.
Yeah. And thank you, Caitlin, for representing One Parent Family Scotland.
Thank you for listening, and if you'd like to take part in a podcast recording, please get in touch by dropping us an email at info@opfs.org.uk. And to listen to more episodes, please subscribe to our podcast channel. Thank you.